Good afternoon, everybody. We're now moving into our panel discussion, which will explore some of the most complex and interconnected challenges facing the higher education sector today, ranging from student complaints and accommodation safety through to freedom of speech, institutional responsibility, and emerging regulatory expectations. I have the pleasure of moderating this panel today. I'm Jade Raylan, Unimutual's casualty underwriter, and I'm very pleased to be joined by an experienced panel, each bringing a distinct perspective across law, insurance, student advocacy, and residential education. First, we have Patrick Reardon, Principal at Thomson Cooper Lawyers. Patrick has over 15 years' experience advising Unimutual members and higher education institutions across Australia. He specialises in public liability, professional negligence, discrimination and harassment matters, privacy compliance, and regulatory investigations. Patrick regularly works at the intersection of legal risk, governance, and institutional decision-making, particularly in complex or sensitive claims environments. Next, we have Jax Hanna, Senior Assistant Ombudsman with the National Student Ombudsman. Jax has worked across local, state, and Commonwealth government with a strong focus on complaints handling, incident management, regulation, and systemic improvement. Her work centres on ensuring accountability in complex service systems and, importantly, protecting students from harm before it occurs. Next is Nick Murphy, Casualty Manager at General Reinsurance. Nick brings more than 30 years of experience across direct insurance and reinsurance with executive backgrounds in underwriting, claims management, and market strategy. He has also lectured in liability insurance at the postgraduate level and is well known for his deep understanding of emerging casualty risks in the education sector. Finally, on the end there, we have Lisa Sutherland, President of University Colleges Australia and Master of Wesley College at the University of Sydney. Lisa brings extensive experience in both secondary and tertiary education with a long-standing focus on student wellbeing, pastoral care and residential life. She's held multiple leadership roles across the residential college sector and brings a practitioner's perspective on balancing student safety, autonomy and community culture. Thank you all for joining us today. Right, Nick, I'd like to start with you and focus on what we're seeing across course delivery and student complaints, because this is often the first signal that something's going wrong with an institution. We've seen a noticeable rise in course-related complaints, particularly around the quality of delivery, assessment practices, and accreditation outcomes. From your perspective, what trends are you seeing emerge and what concerns you most from an insurance and liability standpoint?
Yeah, okay. So from an insurance point of view, a liability point of view, one thing that we focus on most is the large claims. So there's always a steady frequency of what we call attritional claims, but the large claims can really upset the loss ratio, but ultimately that's why you buy insurance. So amongst the large claims, what we have seen recently, I can talk about what's in the public domain, class actions against Uni of Western Sydney and Uni of Newcastle for medical engineering and health degrees which did not meet expectation, did not lead to accreditation. Now, class actions are very large claims. Now, first of all, both University of Western Sydney and University of Newcastle are very high quality institutions. So I was quite surprised when I read about that. I guess they probably were too. But ultimately, that's why you buy insurance. We're there to protect against those unexpected losses, and those were two very large unexpected losses which came through, which underwriters will have to deal with. But we've also seen ASQA getting a lot more active in recent years. They've disqualified a couple of smaller colleges. There was Elite College Australia and Australian Educational and Career College. But they've also, besides disqualifying or taking away the accreditation of colleges, they've also actually closed down certain specific courses within other colleges. So these are the sort of actions which affect a large number of students at once, and they're the sort of actions which can lead to potentially very large underwriting losses, depending on the outcome.
Yep. Thank you. And so building on from that, from an underwriting perspective, what emerging risks in the education sector give you the greatest concern? Is it the class actions? Particularly when we think about the institution's responsibility to provide safe, supportive and academically sound environments for students.
Well, one of the changes which I'm seeing in the education sector over the last 10 years is more and more highly specialised courses. So 20 years ago, the big universities ran engineering faculties which had a choice of maybe 6 specialties. Now there's hundreds of choices. There's so many different detailed specialties out there, specialisations of degrees out there, that it must make it very hard for the universities to firstly, make sure they all lead to the expected accreditation, but also as these new specialised courses keep coming through more and more every year, it must be very hard for the universities to gauge the expectations of the students when these courses have only existed for a couple of years. And so I think that's an emerging trend amongst universities, which could, it's an issue which underwriters need to keep aware of.
Thanks, Nick. Lisa, turning to campus safety and student accommodation, this continues to be an area of heightened scrutiny. So from your experience, what do you see as the biggest safety risks facing students today, both on campus and within residential accommodation, and how effectively are institutions responding to those risks?
Thanks, Jade. So when we talk about accommodation sector, we're talking about quite a broad perspective. I master at Wesley looking after the not-for-profit sector, but we've got university-owned, we've got purpose-built student accommodation, which are the more commercially owned ones, as well as the not-for-profits. So they are quite broad, so my experience is drawing from the not-for-profit, but I've got a bit more broader experience. I think there's probably three key areas that are major risks for us with students, and remembering that we're dealing very closely with human beings when we're talking about their accommodation. I think the first one would be mental health and concerns for students around mental health. We've certainly seen in the last 10 to 15 years a significant growth in the identification of mental health issues for students. I think one of the difficulties that students face when they're living in our accommodation is often they've moved away from home for the first time. So if you think about whether they're in accommodation or even just living around the universities and they're moving to capital cities in most cases, they've moved away from that strong family structure that they've had. So whether they're completely separated from their families or they're just forming their own form of independence, anxiety, concerns around those sorts of things. The other big thing is, it's a really interesting perspective that the students that we're looking after in accommodation, which are that 17 to 25-year-old age group, they're so socially connected on social media, but they're actually our most isolated generation. So they feel isolated, they feel lonely, and this is our 18 to 25-year-olds. And part of that is around the world that they see on social media looks quite different to the world that they're experiencing. And of course that's particularly highlighted when they move away from home or they're trying to find their feet in a new institution, thinking about how large our institutions are in Australia at university level. So mental health concerns is a big one. The second key piece is around harm. Harm in terms of hazing, bullying, harassment, and harm in terms of sexual harm as well. That's the other key thing that we're seeing. You'll be aware of the national code that's come in from the 1st of January 2026, and that's put a very big highlight on the gender-based violence piece. But it goes broader than just that gender-based violence piece. It goes to wider harm, and I think that's one of the things that we have to look at. Accommodation is in a place where we can spend quite a bit of time because we are relatively small in terms of the education and preventative space. So that's certainly something that we're focusing on. And I think the third thing, which is probably prevalent across both mental health concerns for students and rise in that, as well as the harm space, would be alcohol. Alcohol and the use of alcohol by young people in Australia. So I think they'd be the three key areas.
Thanks, Lisa. Just on the alcohol piece, it obviously continues to be a major contributor to harm, so particularly around orientation periods and social events. So what responsibilities do organisations have to actively manage those alcohol-related risks?
Yeah, I think a lot has changed in this space more recently. If you're thinking about accommodation, so again, some of the large PBSAs, you've got 1,000 people living within one complex, and we know for a fact that, for example, in residential colleges where there's common dining facilities, common facilities for recreation, students are more likely to come together, which is quite different if you're living in a studio in a larger complex. the difficulty to come out of those rooms to gather. So it's quite complex, the issues. I think within residential colleges, many of them have licences now and operate all of their events under very strict licensing, under RSA rules and regulations. In terms of what the organisation's responsibility is, I think when it's under a licence and when there's very strict rules, it's very, very clear. There's no leeway there. I think the issue, though, for young people when you're 18 to 25 and you're living together, it's when there are no rules in place, if that makes sense. And I'd say this comes back to I think it's a much harder question, it's a much bigger question that accommodation, in the accommodation sector we're dealing with all of the time, and people don't talk about it enough, is it's all about the culture. I mean, the culture piece is the biggest education and prevention piece that we can actually work on together when we live in communities. Potentially quite different to what universities have in terms of culture being more driven by codes of conduct and values, but within residential communities, you've got communities that come together quite closely, you've got a lot of staff in these areas, and so the development of culture will help you change all of the levers where there are issues, particularly around alcohol. And the other thing that I'll say around alcohol, and it's quite an interesting piece when people become quite risk averse about alcohol. And alcohol, once you're over 18, is legal in Australia. You can go to the pub, you can drink in your own homes. I think universities potentially are going down an interesting path when we make welcome weeks or orientation weeks completely alcohol-free. And we all understand why we might take that option, but it means that when Welcome Week finishes, or I call it Welcome Week because at Sydney University we did the Broderick Review and we weren't allowed to call it Orientation Week anymore. When Welcome Week finishes or Orientation Week finishes, nothing changes on that last day, and then the next day they can start drinking again. And that isn't necessarily, in my personal view, a good approach to actually developing good cultural outcomes, good learnings, good experiences. So there's a little piece around working out how far do you go there to get the balance right and to get it right moving forward, because weeks 1, 2 and 3 can be quite difficult in a residential accommodation if there hasn't been some learnings and some good examples and guidance along the way.
Thanks, Lisa. I think we had a session yesterday where we were talking about student safety, and I think we often forget that these students are adults that we're dealing with. We're not dealing with high school students. So, yes, there is an institutional responsibility, but we are ultimately dealing with adults at the end of the day.
Emerging adults is something I like to call them.
Patrick, the student experience doesn't sit in a vacuum, and Australia's political and social landscape is clearly shifting. Australia's political landscape's evolving with growing debate around academic freedom, protest rights and institutional neutrality. How are these shifts affecting the student experience on campus?
Thank you, Jade. I think university campuses seem always to have...
I don't know if... Can you guys hear him? Yeah? Okay.
Seem always to have been places where politics and political issues have been prominent. I think perhaps in more recent years there have been examples of issues for which the temperature has been turned up considerably, and also where there are very polarised views on that particular issue, and that has been combined with, I think, first an increased awareness on the part of everyone as to what their rights are, including as to their rights to safety and respect, but also an environment that allows and encourages people to raise grievances and complaints. And I think that has created a bit of a perfect storm in this particular issue in more recent years.
Yeah. Where do you see the line between protecting freedom of speech and ensuring student safety, particularly for marginalised and vulnerable groups? And then connected to that, how do institutions balance academic freedom with their obligation to provide consistent, high-quality teaching? It's an easy one for you, Patrick.
No, yeah, it's a fascinating one, and it's a very difficult one for anyone to get right. And I think there was an attempt some years ago with in about 2019. There was a report by Robert French, who had been the Chancellor of the University of Western Australia and also had been the Chief Justice of the High Court, and tried to nail this issue in one document by inquiring as to the status of academic freedom and free speech on campuses, and concluding that whilst those topics were not in a crisis, the way that universities in particular often had codes of conduct that were expressed using very broad language tended to infringe or could infringe on free speech and academic freedom in those environments, and but concluded, notwithstanding that it was important and it was necessary for organisations to ensure that free speech didn't become a vehicle through which there could be unfair disadvantage, discrimination against particular groups on a campus, and to that end was supportive of reasonable measures being taken by institutions where necessary to achieve that. And that sort of seemed to, almost provide the conceptual answer to that issue, but in the constant level of change that we have been seeing, a few years after that, you had the state and territory-based work health and safety laws reformed to include a positive duty to eliminate or, if not possible, minimise psychosocial harm in workplaces, and not just to employees, but also to anyone who was associated with that particular workplace. And that, I think, created a little bit of, in fact, quite a lot more uncertainty for organisations as to how you deal with this issue. And an example, there was a university very recently that copped in New South Wales, from Safe Work New South Wales, a preliminary report that basically concluded that it had fostered or allowed a psychologically unsafe workplace by failing to stick to its own standards in terms of how it responded to certain protest activity on the campus and how that had affected people. And obviously that it created a very difficult situation, because the organisation in question is left on the one hand with federal legislation telling it that as part of its accreditation it was required to ensure and enshrine freedom of speech and academic freedom, with the support, it thought, of the Justice French report. And on the other hand, you have state or territory-based regulation saying, no, you must ensure, you must eliminate, in fact, that's the word used, psychosocial risk, and if it's not possible to do so, then you can minimise it. It's a very difficult position to be in, and it raises the prospect of how you actually deal with that in a way that's practical. And I think that's very difficult as well, because any decision that you make it's never going to be possible to make a decision that everyone will be happy with. If you make a decision that somehow wades into one of these heavily polarised issues, you're invariably going to either upset some people or maybe everyone, and if you make a decision that is based on what somebody has said or how or what banner they're holding up or whatever it might be, you're invariably going to be accused of exercising some sort of judgment as to the appropriateness of what they are saying. And that's obviously a pretty unhelpful place to be, because you're not going to, you could just be putting petrol on the fire. You may not be, you could just make one group happy while enraging a different group. And I think that when you're forced to balance the safety obligations under state law, but also under the federal principles, against, you know, your institutional desire to promote, you know, free thinking and free inquiry and academic freedom. I think as far as possible, you don't want to be seen to be making those judgments or decisions about what you can say and what you can't say. And so wherever possible, if you can have rule systems, codes of conduct that refer very specifically to what or as specifically as possible to what can and can't be done, and weigh and focus on the how of expression rather than what you express. You know, for example, you might, you know, instead of having a rule that says you can't, you know, have forms of expression that offend or you know, intimidate, perhaps you should, you know, a better rule might be saying, well, you can't, you know, disrupt learning activities, or you can't, you know, you can't block access to a physical space. You can't, you know, impede the free use or passage or enjoyment of common areas by other members of the community. And in that way, you're trying to set yourself up to being able to discharge all of your obligations by focusing on what, on something that everyone can agree on, you know, the facts and the physicality of what's happening as opposed to the content of the ideas.
It's very complex, isn't it? Really tough to navigate.
I think so.
Thanks, Patrick. Jax, I'd like to bring you in here by looking at what the data's telling us. The Racism at Uni survey revealed patterns that many institutions hadn't fully acknowledged. From your perspective, what findings were the most surprising or concerning, and what do you think they signal about emerging risks or trends our members need to prepare for now to ensure safer, more inclusive environments for all students?
Thanks, Jade. So the focus at the National Student Ombudsman's Office in this space is largely in the complaints handling and learning from the complaints space as to what we're seeing for these really serious student experiences. And it is really concerning that the survey found that students who have used university complaints handling processes are really highly dissatisfied with the process and with the outcomes, which I think goes to some of what you were saying in what are the policies that we've got in place in relation to people's expression of what's happening for them. Are the processes fair? Are they transparent? Have we clearly communicated them in a way that students can engage with? Do we examine them to make sure that the processes themselves are free from bias and that we have that eye to what are the systems that support people in managing risk when those things are happening? But back to the complaints process, we saw a really high prevalence of complainants indicating that they felt that their complaint made no difference. They felt the process itself added to their distress. They didn't trust the people involved in the process, and the process itself was too long and it was too complex. And we see that in the complaints that are coming through to the National Student Ombudsman's Office as well. About 5% of the complaints that we see relate to racism, discrimination or racial vilification or inadequate supports in relation to those matters. And after our first year of operation, we've had over 250 individuals come to us in relation to this. And that's even in the face of what we know are significant barriers for students to come forward and talk about these very personal, serious, significant events for them, alongside a real risk of them being re-traumatised, having to go through a complaints process and tell their story about what they've experienced in this space. So one of the things that the Racism at Uni report highlights, and that we see in our data as well, is that a lot of students aren't coming forward and reporting due to fear of reprisal. They're fearful that if they come and make a complaint, there will be detrimental consequences for them. So one of the things that I see as really great about the establishment of the NSO is that in our legislation there are protections for students against reprisal. We can also accept group complaints, we can accept anonymous complaints, and with consent we can accept complaints on behalf of students. So the Racism at Uni report does make some really practical recommendations for you to have a look at to see how you can actually respond to what this information's telling us. And you can act on those right now, some of them, or at the very least, examine them and look at what will work in your space, where you have the gaps and where they apply, and in a risk lens for you to make the most impact quickly. So what we want to see is that you are making sure that students aren't too afraid. You're welcoming feedback and communicating that you will welcome and act on the feedback. That you are ensuring that your complaint staff understand their obligations in relation to protecting students from reprisal. That you are making sure that you have set up your processes so that you're front-loading those supports for students, especially for those particularly complex, sensitive, personal, potentially traumatic experiences that the students are coming forward with. Another thing that we've observed is that a lot of students go to the dean level with their complaints, particularly in these kinds of matters. So do your policies support the deans to know what they're meant to be doing? Are they trained? Are they culturally competent? Are we making sure that we're capturing the data and giving the appropriate responses to make sure that the deans are empowered to act, that they know what they should be doing, and that we're learning from that experience as well. So how are you showing students that you're listening to their complaints to, again, encourage them to come forward so that we can make the changes that need to happen in this space? We're hearing from students that they don't feel that universities are doing enough in that systemic change space. And we need to make sure that we're supporting the individual, but that we're learning from those experiences and making the change to prevent further harm from occurring for people. And I think forums like this are great as well. I think learning from each other and taking the best of what everybody has learned from their years of experience and sharing the challenge that I know you're all experiencing. And how do we use that to make sure that we're equipping complaints units to have fair and transparent and equitable processes?
Thanks, Jack. Your own motion investigation report highlighted how overly broad confidentiality requirements can unintentionally silence students and limit access to support, particularly in cases involving gender-based violence. From your perspective, what does reasonable and proportionate confidentiality look like in practice, and what is the single most important change our members should make right now to get this balance right?
Thank you. So this also goes back to making it safe for students to come forward. We know that the confidentiality requirements restrict what students can say and when they can say it and who they can say it to. But our investigation found that that is sometimes applied automatically to students, whether they know it's applying or not, from the outset of them making the complaint. So they may not actually know what their obligations are in that space. Also that it's not necessarily clear what the requirements are or when they might end. So when do the restrictions stop? And it's not always allowed in the policy for students, for those exceptions, to let the student get the support that they might need. So what we want to see is that in practice, to make sure that students don't feel like they would be silenced or disempowered, that they own their story, they own their experience, and that we can set up our systems to make sure that the recovery from a traumatic experience is genuinely supportive and empowering, is step out what the requirements are. How do they work? What does need to be confidential about an active complaint? Because there are genuine reasons why a provider would choose to apply confidentiality requirements to a process. But we need to be transparent about what they are, clear what they are, and why they're there. We also really need to be clear about when they apply and when they end, and that they're only for the complaints or misconduct process itself. And it goes back to making sure that we're not preventing students from coming forward, we're not preventing students from getting the support that they need to get through their experience, and that we are getting those genuine exceptions for psychosocial support, the health and professional support, their legal advice, their family experience and support, and those external recourse avenues like the National Student Ombudsman. So I think make sure your processes are clear, that they're trauma-informed, that they are student-centred, that it's really transparent what that means, and it allows for people to get the support that they need. Again, welcome the complaints and make sure that people are safe when they're engaging with you and following through with a fair, transparent process.
Thanks, Jax. Amazingly, we're actually running well ahead of time. So if there are any questions, we've got a couple of roving mics around.
Thanks. We've got one question here. If you give institutions one piece of advice to improve student outcomes or reduce risk, what would it be? Anyone want to start?
I'll just kick off with some general principles. From my perspective, I think it does go back to putting the student at the centre and making sure that your approaches are trauma-informed. So one of the things that I've observed is that you don't always know what's going on for somebody. You may not be aware that they've experienced trauma or are experiencing trauma, and the trauma-informed approach, it benefits everybody. It's how are you empowering people, how are you clearly communicating, how are you transparent and upfront about what the process looks like, what it's designed to achieve, and then out of the process, what are you learning from it? Do you have systems to capture the data that tells you what's going on, and then to escalate those, what are the things that we can do to make the change so this doesn't happen again?
I might jump in with one other thing that I've seen done well, and that is that sometimes if you have a situation where there's a student who has made one or more complaints, and due to how aggrieved they are, they're looking like they're at risk of making more, and sending them off to all sorts of different external organisations. By actually, what I've seen done well is a student like that has actually been given somebody who to talk to within the university, and who actually has been somebody who has a little bit of a sympathetic ear and perhaps is a good listener, and can help them and help sort of direct traffic in terms of identifying where, help them talk through their grievances, work out which ones might be valid and which ones might not be, and the best way in which to take them up. And it can sort of avoid otherwise what could turn out to be a total scattergun approach, where complaints and allegations are fired off in all sorts of different directions, that creates a much bigger problem to be solved. And if the resources can be found to find someone who can actually who's not directly involved in whatever has given rise to the complaint, but if that person can actually be nominated to have periodic catch-ups with the student and just talk through issues, it can throw a bit of cold water on some of the complaints and some of the grievances that seem to be bubbling up, and perhaps just like what Jax was saying, giving it makes the person feel a lot more listened to, and as opposed to just dealing with some big bureaucracy that sort of is set in its ways.
I'd just add a little bit more to that, is because what we see in the data too is that sometimes that better, more engaged explanation helps to get a good outcome for everybody involved. It's not necessarily about changing an outcome, but it is that explanation of how it applied in these circumstances, or what the considerations were, and how it was, how the decision happened, who made it, how are they empowered to do it, what information did they consider. And often it is just that talking through what was it that happened and getting that better explanation alongside that bit of support.
Jade, I'd add, you can never predict when someone's going to come forward with a complaint or a disclosure, and who they're going to come forward to. So I would absolutely emphasise training all your staff, because it's not just going to be your counsellor or your dean level or, you know, the complaints part of a faculty within a university or your pastoral care team within a college. So it's all staff being trained in trauma-informed response. And I'd go one step further and say it's not a one-off training, it has to be regular.
Thanks, Lisa. Did you have another question, Chris?
Yeah, we do have another question. It's how should we balance duty of care with student autonomy and independence? Anyone want to tackle that one?
I think listening's really important. I think being an active listener to adults. I mean, I think in accommodation we deal with this all the time. Often the students will not only raise problems with you, but they'll also be part of the solution if you get actively involved with them. So I think holding them up and scaffolding them and supporting them to become good leaders, good decision makers is really, really important, rather than taking a top-down approach. I think they come out of secondary schools having had a top-down approach, and I think they're expecting more from us within universities and residential colleges.
And we've got another question. Across your experience, what is one student-related trend you're seeing more frequently, and why do you think it's emerging?
I might jump in with one. I've seen, again, in looking at it from within a complaints perspective, I've just seen the breadth in recent years of probably the worst of, or the most complex of the student complaints are much broader and more challenging to resolve than they used to be. And I think that one reason for that is because, I mean, there always will be complaints and there always will be events that give rise to complaints. And maybe, you know, again, it's a function of systems that don't make people feel satisfied or listened to, like we've heard about. But also, I think there's an increased awareness amongst students of what their rights are, and also what recourse is out there for them if they make a complaint to this body or that body. And there are matters that I think are being increasingly seen where a given event, you know, something will take place and it will cause, you know, a dispute between a student and the institution. But, you know, fast forward 6 months and you'll have parallel sort of complaints or procedures or investigations being conducted in more than one external body, plus, you know, a number of internal complaints bodies as well, and it becomes very difficult to ensure consistency, and just in terms of how labour intensive it is for the organisation to keep on top of these things and to ensure that it's you know, it's doing its best to resolve and deal with the complaint across each individual front.
Great, thanks, Patrick. Nick, did you have anything that you wanted to add in terms of what you're seeing as a trend?
Sorry, I didn't catch that, sorry. Sorry, I didn't catch that.
Oh, sorry. Was there anything that you're seeing from your perspective as emerging trend?
Look, something which is still a question in my mind when it comes to all these student complaints is what effect the National Ombudsman will have on the insurance experience. So, for example, I think the National Ombudsman will cause a lot more claims to come out of the woodwork and flush out a lot more claims. That could be an adverse effect on the insurance result. But on the other hand, they're more likely to settle their claims by mediation rather than by compensation, which could have a positive effect on the insurance result. It's still too early to tell, so I'm not really sure how that part will play out. Doesn't exactly answer the question directly, but...
No, and I think one of the things that we're also hoping to achieve is to provide that guidance and education about how to make those systemic changes that we see in what students are coming to us with and about, is how do we head off the challenges and the issues and policies and approaches that are leading to the complaints, so that we do prevent that harm, which it'll be interesting to see what happens in the data. I think awareness and what that looks like for how it drives insurance matters, but also how does the trauma-informed response drive people's experience of a complaints process to resolve what's going on for them, and how are we getting that flow-through impact of making the change.
Overall, I'm quite hopeful that the impact of the National Ombudsman will be positive on the liability experience of the universities and therefore the insurers as well. Time will tell.
Great. So does anybody have a question from the floor?
So Robbie from University of Tasmania. Now, universities have historically been places of expression, right? Like, in your university you have these student protests regarding, say, pro-Palestine, pro-Israel and everything, right? We had one a couple of years ago where we had student body actually camping out on our campus, right, okay, protesting against a very kind of, I would say, a fluid argument, or whatever the thing was, politically, I would say, it wasn't a rally, but it was a protest, right? So from an insurance point of view as well, obviously there were two parties to the same opinion, like political opinion about the pro-Palestine and pro-Israel. We let them protest on our campuses, on our grounds, as they are allowed to. It's a freedom of expression. Like, you are free to express in this free world, right? Especially in our university campuses. From an insurance point of view, this can often escalate to a conflict or a, I would say, damage of property or damage of the campus, or what's the best advice we can give to organizations or universities on how to handle these sensitive matters? Obviously, we don't want to suppress that freedom of speech. We don't want to suppress that thing, right? But we've got to be careful, because there will be some neutral parties out there, neutral students who just want to go to university and study, right, okay? You also have people who are not as interested, and some people are. Some students are very much interested in the world geopolitical scenarios. Some people are not, How do you think, as lawyers, as insurers, underwriters, and everyone, like, how do we, as a university, how do we actually kind of deal with this scenario where so much is at stake from both student point of view and as from university's point of view too?
Yeah, well, that's quite a minefield. It's very difficult for universities to come up with procedures and guidelines on who's allowed to say what at any particular event. So I think the onus on universities is getting very difficult, but as to coming up with a set of guidelines and on what people are allowed to say at events at universities and then enforcing them is very difficult. The universities have a lot more control over the academic staff and what they're allowed to say as far as freedom of speech goes. But at events where students can speak their minds, the universities have much less control. From a legal point of view, I'm not really, I find it very difficult to come up with a solution for the universities. Patrick, do you have some suggestions?
Yeah, it's a super hard one, because the law says you have to do both things. You have to look after the people, and you also have to protect the right of people to say what they think. And that's very easy to write down, on a statute book, but it's very hard to apply in practice. And I think that's probably where the question comes from. And because you are going to, many of the people who participate in activities like that, protests, etc., they're literally there to express their strongly held conviction about a particular issue, and they have a right to do so. But of course, there are those people who just want to turn up and get to their class and receive their education and then go home again. And at the other extreme, you're going to have people for whom hearing that message of protest is going to, be deeply distressing for them. And so, how do you balance all of those competing priorities? And my own view is that that it's going to be difficult, and whatever you do is not going to please everyone. But a good way to do it is to, I think, say that our core, business activities as a university, is to, educate and provide a service from our people to the students who are our customers. We need to maintain our ability to deliver that service, and therefore we will not tell you what you can and can't say, but we might tell you that no, you're not allowed to, block this space for more than a particular amount of time. You're not allowed to sort of charge into a lecture that's underway and start making noise and shouting about some issue because there are people who they're just trying to learn. And so, also, when you make those decisions, you need to do it in a way that is informed as to, look, if I permit these people to do this because it's their right, what impact might that have on others, and how am I going to put measures in place that also listens to the perspectives of those other people and provides, if necessary, support or security measures to make sure that their interests are being protected as well. It's a pretty difficult one to get a proper grasp on, but I think that if it's done from a practical perspective as opposed to an ideological perspective, you might have a chance of designing a regime that is defensible and at least makes a bit of a go at trying to, find the right balance between, the conflicting rights.
Right. Our panellists will be here during afternoon tea if there's any other questions. But thank you very much for joining us today. There's obviously some very complex issues and an evolving landscape. So I really appreciate your time and your insights. And can everyone please join me in thanking our panellists?